When I first saw the house, I wasn't sure if I wanted to get out of the car. It sat there, half swallowed by the trees, like it had been waiting for me for years. The dark wood siding was weathered, almost gray, and the windows stared back like blank judging eyes. It was the kind of place you'd see in a scary movie, the kind you yell at the screen for someone not to go into. But it was mine now. After everything that happened, I needed this. I needed somewhere quiet, far from the pitying looks and murmured condolences. People meant well, I guess, but I couldn't stand it anymore. The house wasn't just a house, it was a chance to start over. The movers wouldn't arrive until the next day, so it was just me and a couple of suitcases. Inside, it smelled like old wood and something damp. Mold, maybe. The floor creaked under my feet as I walked through, and I swear the sound echoed back like the house was alive. There wasn't much furniture left behind, just a faded couch in the living room and a wooden rocking chair by the fireplace. I decided to sit for a minute and soak it all in. The realtor told me a little about the house's history, how it had belonged to a family generations ago and had been empty for years. People in town didn't talk about it much, but I chalked that up to small-town gossip. Old houses always have stories, right? By the time the sun started setting, I was exhausted. I set up a makeshift bed in the corner of the living room with some blankets I'd brought, figuring I'd unpack more tomorrow. Outside, the forest was eerily quiet. No crickets, no wind in the trees, just silence. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, like it's pressing down on you. Then I heard it. At first it sounded like the wind brushing through the leaves, soft and almost soothing. But as I lay there staring at the dark ceiling, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was inside, a faint whisper, low and muffled, almost like someone was calling my name. Marina. I sat up so fast I nearly tripped over the blanket. My heart was pounding, and I strained to listen, but there was nothing, just the creak of the old house settling. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, it had been a long day, and I was still getting used to this place. But the feeling of being watched lingered, crawling up the back of my neck. In the morning, the house felt different. The sunlight streaming through the windows made it seem less ominous, almost welcoming. I convinced myself that I'd let my nerves get the best of me last night. Still, I couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in my chest. When I walked into the kitchen, I noticed a small drawer I hadn't seen before tucked under the counter. Inside was a small, leather-bound journal, the edges worn and brittle. The name on the first page stopped me cold. Abigail Carter. Flipping through, I found page after page of messy handwriting, talking about voices, shadows, and dreams that wouldn't stop. One line stood out. "The house knows your secrets." I slammed the journal shut, my pulse racing. Suddenly, I didn't feel like I was alone anymore. I spent the rest of that morning trying to distract myself. I unpacked boxes, cleaned surfaces, and even rearranged the little furniture that was left behind. Anything to keep my mind off that damn journal. But no matter what I did, I kept hearing that line in my head. The house knows your secrets. By mid-afternoon, the sky outside had turned gray, and the forest seemed even darker than before. It felt like the house had swallowed the sunlight, and the shadows crept closer with every passing hour. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The whispers started again that evening. This time they weren't soft or distant. They were clear. Marina. It was a child's voice, Lily's voice. My chest tightened, and I froze in place, listening. "Marina, come find me." I nearly dropped the glass of water I was holding. It couldn't be her. It just couldn't. My hands were shaking as I stumbled toward the sound, which seemed to come from the hallway. But as soon as I stepped out of the kitchen, everything went silent. I stood there, heart pounding, staring down the dimly lit hallway. It was empty, just as I knew it would be. But for a brief moment, I thought I saw something, just a flicker of movement, at the very end near the basement door. I told myself not to go. I told myself it was nothing, but my feet moved on their own. The basement door was old, painted a faded blue, and had a rusty lock hanging from it. I hadn't even noticed it before. Now, standing in front of it, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I reached out, hesitated, and finally touched the doorknob. It was ice cold, sending a shiver up my arm. My stomach churned as I turned it, but the door didn't budge. The lock rattled, and I realized I'd need a key. "Marina, don't." I jumped back so fast I nearly fell. The voice was right behind me, but when I turned around, the hallway was empty. My breathing was ragged as I backed away from the door and rushed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind me like it would keep whatever this was out. That night, I didn't sleep. Every creak, Every groan of the house made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I swore I heard footsteps moving through the house. Slow and deliberate, they stopped just outside my bedroom door, and I held my breath, waiting for whatever it was to come in. But nothing happened. By morning, I was a wreck. I barely ate, barely thought straight. All I could focus on was that door and the whispers. I decided to call someone in town. Maybe they could tell me more about the house, or at least help me feel less like I was losing my mind. Maggie, the woman who'd warned me about the place, was my first choice. When I arrived at her shop, she gave me a long look, like she'd been expecting me. "I told you," she said, her voice low and serious. "That house, it's not just old. It remembers things." "Remembers?" I asked, not sure if I should laugh or cry. She nodded. "You're not the first person to hear things in there. The Carters, the ones who lived there before, they left without a word. Abigail was the last, and no one's seen her since. Some folks say the house takes things from you. Memories, people, sanity." My head spun. "That's ridiculous," I muttered, trying to convince myself as much as her. But Maggie just shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe it's not." When I got home, the house felt heavier, like it was holding its breath. I couldn't help but go back to the hallway, staring at that locked door. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse somehow. I decided to search the house for the key. If I could just open the door and see what was inside, maybe all of this would make sense. After hours of searching, I found it hidden behind a loose brick in the fireplace. It was small and old, with a tarnished finish that left a metallic smell on my fingers. Standing in front of the basement door again, I hesitated. Every instinct told me to leave it alone, but I couldn't. I had to know. As the lock clicked open, a rush of cold air spilled out and a smell hit me. Something damp and rotting. I shone a flashlight down the stairs and my stomach twisted. There were drawings on the walls, crude and childlike, but the images weren't innocent. They showed people screaming, trapped in flames, their faces twisted in agony. And then I heard it again, clear as day. "Why did you do it, Marina?" I dropped the flashlight, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the floor. I didn't pick up the flashlight right away. I just stood there staring at the flickering beam as it spun across the damp walls of the basement. My hands were cold and clammy, my breath shallow. The voice echoed in my head again, louder this time, more accusing. "Why did you do it, Marina?" I wanted to scream back that I hadn't done anything, but the words got stuck in my throat. My legs moved on their own, slowly taking me down the stairs, one creaking step at a time. The air grew colder with every inch I descended, and the smell of mildew and decay grew stronger. When I reached the bottom, the room opened up into a space I hadn't expected. It was larger than I thought, the ceiling low and the walls covered in more of those grotesque, childlike drawings. Fire, pain, faces melting into darkness. In the middle of the room stood a tall oval mirror with a tarnished gold frame, its surface cracked like a spiderweb. I didn't want to look, but something about it pulled me closer. My feet dragged across the damp concrete floor as if I were being guided. "Don't," I whispered to myself, my voice shaking. But I couldn't stop. When I finally stood in front of the mirror, I saw nothing at first, just my pale face staring back, wide-eyed and terrified. But then, the surface rippled like water, and the reflection changed. It was the house. Flames licked the walls, and thick smoke billowed up to the ceiling. A figure appeared, blurred at first, then sharper. It was Ethan. He was banging on a door, his face twisted in panic. Behind him was Lily, crying, her tiny fists pounding against the same door. "No," I whispered, stumbling back. "No, no, no." The reflection followed me as I moved, like it wanted me to watch. The scene shifted, and suddenly, I was there too, standing outside the room. But this wasn't me. It couldn't be me. This version of me held a matchbox, her face twisted in rage. I shook my head violently, tears streaming down my face. "That's not real, that's not real." "It is." The voice came from the mirror, but it wasn't Ethan or Lily. It was me. My reflection stared back at me, her eyes dark and empty. "You did it, Marina," the reflection hissed. "You locked them in, you lit the fire, and now they're gone because of you." "No," I screamed, grabbing a nearby chair and hurling it at the mirror. The glass shattered, shards flying everywhere, but the image didn't disappear. Instead, it spread across the room, the walls flickering with the same burning scene. The voices were everywhere now. Ethan's pleading, Lily's cries, my own angry shouts. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick and suffocating. I stumbled backward, clutching my head, trying to drown out the noise. Suddenly, the whispers changed. They weren't pleading anymore. They were laughing, soft, mocking laughter that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. When I looked up, the drawings on the walls began to move. The figures of fire and torment came alive, twisting and writhing as if trying to crawl off the walls. One by one they turned to face me, their empty eyes boring into my soul. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, my legs barely carrying me as the laughter followed. The basement door slammed shut behind me, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look back. I ran to the living room, my chest heaving, and collapsed onto the floor. For a moment the house was silent again. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. But then the floorboards creaked, slowly, deliberately. I looked up, and there they were, Ethan and Lily, standing in the doorway to the kitchen, their faces pale and ghostly, their eyes filled with something I couldn't place. Anger? Sadness? "Why did you do it, Marina?" Ethan asked, his voice soft but full of accusation. "I didn't," I choked out, shaking my head. "I didn't do it." Lily stepped forward, her tiny hand reaching out to me. "You locked the door, Mommy. You didn't want us anymore." "No!" I screamed, scrambling to my feet. "That's not true. I loved you both. The words caught in my throat as the memories hit me all at once. The fights, the jealousy, the matchbox in my hand. The truth slammed into me like a freight train, and I fell to my knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." As I sat there, broken and trembling, I felt the house shift around me. The air grew warmer, the walls closer, and then I smelled it, the unmistakable scent of smoke. When I looked up, the living room was on fire. Flames danced across the walls, and the ceiling cracked and groaned. Ethan and Lily were gone, replaced by shadows that circled me, laughing and whispering. "You know what you have to do," the voices said in unison. I looked at the flames and nodded. They were right. The flames spread faster than I thought they would. The walls, old and brittle, caught fire like they'd been waiting for this moment all along. Heat pressed against my skin, and the thick, choking smoke clawed at my throat. I didn't move, didn't run. This was it. This was what the house wanted. I could still hear them, Ethan and Lily's voices mixed with the crackle of the fire, faint but persistent. Their words weren't angry anymore, just sad. "You could have saved us." Tears blurred my vision as I tried to speak, but no sound came out. My body shook with sobs. My knees pressed into the splintered floorboards. The shadows danced along the walls, growing taller, their laughter louder. It wasn't just my family anymore. It was everyone the house had taken before me. The voices blended together into a haunting symphony of blame and sorrow. I looked at the flames and thought about how easy it would be to let go, to let the fire take me too. Maybe then I'd be with them again. Maybe then they'd forgive me. But something stopped me. As the fire crept closer, licking at the edges of the rug beneath me, I realized that this wasn't just about my guilt. This was the house feeding on me, on my pain, on every terrible thing I'd buried deep inside. It wasn't letting me atone. It was consuming me. For the first time, I felt anger. Real burning anger. Not at Ethan or Lily, not even at myself, but at this cursed place. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse from the smoke. I forced myself to stand, every muscle in my body trembling. "You don't get to win." I stumbled toward the kitchen, where I'd seen the gasoline earlier that day. My hands fumbled with the canister, and I nearly dropped it as the heat grew unbearable. The voices screamed now, begging me to stop, warning me of what would happen. "Don't do it," they howled. "You'll regret it." But I wasn't listening. I splashed the gasoline across the floors and walls, choking back coughs as the air grew thicker with smoke. The flames caught instantly, roaring to life with a fury that matched my own. The house groaned, its wooden beams snapping like bones as the fire consumed everything in its path. The shadows writhed, their laughter turning into screams. "You can't destroy us," the voices screeched. "We are you, Marina. We are everything you've done." I grabbed a match from the counter, my hands shaking so badly I could barely strike it. "Maybe you are," I said, my voice barely audible over the chaos. "But I'm done letting you control me." I lit the match and dropped it onto the last puddle of gasoline at my feet. The flames roared higher, surrounding me in a wall of heat and light. I don't remember much after that. I must have passed out, because the next thing I knew, I was outside, lying on the cold ground. The fire had spread to the trees, lighting up the night sky in a terrifying glow. I don't know how I got out. Maybe the house let me go, or maybe something or someone dragged me out. All I know is that when I opened my eyes, the house was gone. The walls crumbled in on themselves, the roof collapsing into a fiery pit. The voices were gone. The whispers, the laughter, The screams, all of it swallowed by the flames. For the first time in years, I felt quiet. The town called it an accident, just an old house finally giving way to the years. No one believed me when I tried to explain what had really happened, and after a while I stopped trying. I stayed in town for a few months, living in a small apartment above Maggie's shop. She never asked me about the house, but sometimes, late at night, I'd catch her watching me with a knowing look. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself for what happened to Ethan and Lily. Some days the guilt is too much to bear, but other days I think about the fire and how it felt to finally let go. A year later, a young couple bought the land where the house had been. They said they wanted to build something new, something fresh. I didn't warn them. Maybe I should have, but part of me wonders if it would have even mattered. Sometimes late at night I think I hear whispers again, faint and distant, carried on the wind, and I wonder if the house ever really burned at all. You know, I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another client, another case. My job as a child therapist wasn't glamorous, but it felt good to help kids work through their worst nightmares. When I got the call about Mia Sullivan, I was halfway through my morning coffee, staring out the window of my office at the gray Chicago skyline. The voice on the other end belonged to Thomas Sullivan, her father. His tone was flat, almost too calm, like someone who'd run out of ways to process his grief. "She's not talking, hasn't said a word in months," he said. "But she draws." I remember scribbling a few notes, nodding along like I had a clue what I was getting into. "Okay," I said. "Let's set up a time to meet. Bring her in this Friday." Friday came fast. My office wasn't much. Just a few comfy chairs, shelves lined with books that made me look smarter than I felt, and a box of toys for the younger kids. Mia and her dad arrived right on time. She was this tiny thing, all blonde curls and wide eyes that wouldn't look at me. She clung to her father's hand like it was the only thing anchoring her to the ground. "Hi, Mia," I said, crouching to her level. "I'm Lucas. I'm here to help." She didn't say anything, just tucked herself closer to her dad's leg. Thomas gave me a tight-lipped smile. "She'll open up eventually. Hopefully." Eventually turned out to be a generous word. We settled into the first session, me asking gentle questions and Mia ignoring every single one. She sat at the little table I'd set up for her, silently coloring with the markers I'd provided. Thomas handed me a thick stack of paper, her previous drawings. "They're strange," he said, glancing at his daughter like he didn't want her to hear. "I don't know if they mean anything, but I thought you should see them." Later, when I got a chance to go through them, that's when I felt the first twinge of unease. They weren't the usual stick figures or happy sunshines you'd expect from a 7-year-old. The drawings were dark, black scribbles, looming shadows, and figures with enormous glowing eyes. One of them showed a house with a single light on, and outside the window, a tall, faceless shape stared in. I'll admit, it gave me chills, but I brushed it off. Kids process trauma in weird ways. That's what I told myself. Mia didn't make a sound during that first session, but her drawings did all the talking. The second one she worked on was even stranger. She sketched what looked like a living room, and something about it felt familiar. A couch, a coffee table, a tall lamp. It wasn't until later that night, sitting in my own living room, that I realized she'd drawn my living room, down to the angle of the lamp and the coffee mug sitting on the table. I laughed it off, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe I'd mentioned something about my space without realizing it, or maybe it was just generic enough to overlap. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Mia knew something she shouldn't. The weekend came, and I tried to distract myself. TV, a few beers, anything to clear my head. But then, late Saturday night, I heard it. A soft tap, tap, tap against the window of my bedroom. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to wake me. I froze, heart pounding, staring at the sheer curtains that swayed faintly in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the wind or a stray branch. Still, I didn't get much sleep that night. When Monday rolled around, I was ready to dive into our next session. I told myself I was imagining things, that the stress of work was making me paranoid. But as I watched Mia sit at that little table and pick up her markers again, my stomach knotted. She was drawing the outside of my building this time, complete with the tree that always looked like it was leaning too far to the left. She drew a tall, shadowy figure standing at the base of the tree, its glowing eyes boring into the second-floor window. My window. That's when I realized this wasn't just another case. Something about Mia, about her silence and her eerie precision, was pulling me into a world I wasn't ready for. It started small, little things I could explain away if I really tried. The tapping at my window, the strange familiarity of Mia's drawings, the gnawing feeling that I was being watched. But as the days went on, those little things turned into bigger things, harder to ignore, harder to rationalize. Take Tuesday night, for example. I got home late after a long day of sessions, feeling the kind of exhaustion that makes your bones ache. I tossed my keys on the counter and kicked off my shoes, ready to collapse on the couch. But as I walked into the living room, I stopped cold. On my coffee table, there was a piece of paper, a drawing. It wasn't there when I left that morning. Of that I was sure. The drawing showed my bedroom, right down to the unmade bed and the laundry basket I kept meaning to empty. In the corner of the page, half hidden in shadow, was the figure. Tall, faceless, with those same glowing eyes. I wanted to laugh it off, call myself paranoid. Maybe I'd brought one of Mia's drawings home without realizing it. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. My office was locked, my bag hadn't left my side, and Mia had never drawn my bedroom before. That night, the tapping came back, louder this time. I didn't even bother trying to sleep. Instead, I sat on the couch with every light in the apartment turned on, clutching a cup of coffee like it was a lifeline. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker than usual, shifting just enough to make my stomach churn. The next morning, I walked into my office with bloodshot eyes and a caffeine headache, determined to get to the bottom of things. Mia and her father arrived right on time. She shuffled into the room without a word, clutching her usual markers and blank paper. Thomas looked at me, his face lined with exhaustion that mirrored my own. "She's still not sleeping," he said quietly. "Sometimes I hear her talking in her room at night, but when I check, she's alone." That got my attention. "Talking? What does she say?" He shrugged helplessly. "It's hard to make out. Sometimes it sounds like she's answering someone, but there's no one there." I nodded, filing that little nugget away for later. When Mia sat down to draw, I decided to push a little harder. "Mia, do you know the person you've been drawing? The one with the glowing eyes?" Her hand paused mid-stroke just for a second, but she didn't look up. Then she went right back to coloring. "It's okay," I said gently. "You can tell me. Is it someone you've seen before?" This time she stopped completely. Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for the first time, I saw something there. Fear. Not the kind of fear you get from watching a scary movie or hearing a loud noise. This was deeper, primal. It made my skin crawl. She pushed the drawing toward me without a word. This one was different. It wasn't a place I recognized. It showed a clearing in the woods, surrounded by trees that seemed to close in on the page. In the center was a circle of candles, and in the middle of that circle stood the figure, its glowing eyes burning into me, even through the paper. "Mia, what is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. She just stared at me, unblinking, until I couldn't hold her gaze anymore. It felt like she was looking straight through me, into something I didn't even know was there. After the session, I decided I couldn't let it go. I stayed late at the office, combing through everything I could find about Mia's family. That's when I found the first piece of the puzzle, a police report from 2 years ago. It detailed a raid on a rural property connected to Angela Sullivan, Mia's mother. The report mentioned suspected cult activity, but was vague on the details. All I knew was that Angela had been there, and whatever happened that night, it didn't make it into the official record. I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling in my gut. I needed to see that place for myself. So, the next morning, I called in a favor from a buddy on the force, and by lunchtime, I had the address in hand. The property was about an hour outside the city, tucked away in the kind of place where cell service is a suggestion, not a guarantee. The house itself was long gone, reduced to charred rubble, but the woods around it were eerily intact. I parked at the edge of the property and made my way in on foot, the trees swallowing me whole. It didn't take long to find the clearing. It looked exactly like Mia's drawing, the candles, the circle, even the way the trees bent inward as if guarding something. My skin prickled, and every instinct told me to turn around and leave, but I couldn't. I had to know. In the center of the clearing, half buried in the dirt, was an old leather-bound book. I knelt to pick it up, brushing off the dirt and ash. Inside, the pages were filled with handwritten notes and symbols I didn't recognize. But one phrase was repeated over and over. "The door opens when the chosen one arrives." Chosen one. The word sent a chill down my spine, and for the first time I wondered if I was in way over my head. I should have left that book where I found it. I should have walked out of those woods, driven back to the city, and never looked back. But I didn't. Instead, I sat in my car, flipping through pages of symbols and frantic scrawls, trying to make sense of what I was holding. There were diagrams of rituals, strange chants, and what looked like instructions for summoning something. In the margins, there were notes that seemed more desperate the further I read. The eyes see everything. The chosen one cannot escape. The door will open. The air in my car felt suffocating. My hands shook as I slammed the book shut and shoved it into my bag. I had no idea what any of it meant, but one thing was clear. Angela Sullivan was involved in something far darker than I could have imagined. And somehow, Mia was at the center of it. That night, the tapping at my window didn't come. Instead, I woke up to a loud crash in the kitchen. Heart pounding, I grabbed the nearest thing that could pass for a weapon, a heavy flashlight, and crept down the hall. The apartment was dark, the kind of dark that feels alive, pressing in on all sides. I found the source of the noise. The cupboard doors were all open, their contents spilled onto the floor. A broken plate lay shattered near the sink. It didn't make sense. I'd been alone all night, hadn't I? And then I saw it. On the kitchen table was another drawing, but this one wasn't like the others. It wasn't from Mia. The lines were rougher, angrier, as if whoever had drawn it was in a hurry. It showed me, standing in the clearing from earlier with the figure of glowing eyes towering behind me. My breath hitched as I scanned the apartment, every shadow suddenly feeling like it could lunge at me. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. By morning, I was back at the office, pacing the floor like a caged animal, waiting for Mia's session. When she finally walked in, I didn't even bother with pleasantries. "Mia," I said, kneeling in front of her, "I need you to tell me about the person in your drawings. Who are they? What do they want?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment, I thought she was going to ignore me like always, but then she did something that froze me in place. She smiled. It wasn't a child's smile, warm or innocent. It was something cold, knowing, like she held a secret I didn't want to hear. "They're waiting," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who's waiting?" I pressed. "Mia, who are they?" She tilted her head, studying me like I was the one under a microscope. "You'll see." Before I could ask more, she slid another drawing across the table. This one showed my office with me sitting in the chair. Behind me, the glowing-eyed figure loomed, its long, shadowy arms reaching out. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. My pulse roared in my ears as I looked from the drawing to Mia, who just sat there calm as ever. "I'm done," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. "I'm not playing this game anymore." Thomas must have sensed my panic because he shot me a concerned look as he walked Mia out. "Are you okay?" he asked. I didn't answer. I couldn't. That night I made the mistake of opening the book again. I told myself it was to understand, to piece together whatever was happening, but deep down I knew I was just feeding the fear. The diagrams felt sharper, the words more urgent, like they'd shifted since the last time I looked. One page caught my eye, a single sentence scrawled across the middle in jagged handwriting. "The chosen one must face the door." The next thing I knew, I was back in my car, driving to the clearing. The road blurred under the glare of my headlights, and the trees seemed to close in tighter the further I went. I don't remember parking or walking through the woods. It was like I was being pulled by some invisible thread. The clearing was just as I'd left it, but this time it wasn't empty. Candles flickered in a perfect circle, their flames impossibly steady despite the breeze, and in the center stood Mia, clutching a single piece of paper. "Mia!" I called, my voice breaking the silence like a gunshot. "What are you doing here? Who brought you?" She didn't answer. She just held out the paper, her small hand steady as stone. I hesitated before stepping into the circle, the hairs on my arms standing on end. When I took the paper, I wished I hadn't. It was me, again. But this time, the drawing showed me kneeling in the circle, the figure of glowing eyes standing over me, and in the bottom corner, scrawled in Mia's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "It's time." "Mia," I whispered, "what does this mean?" She finally looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a chilling intensity. "The door opens tonight," she said, her voice as calm as if she were discussing the weather. "And you're the key." Before I could react, the candles flared brighter, their flames shooting up like torches. The shadows around the circle moved, twisting and stretching until they formed the figure. It stepped forward, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness, locking onto me. I stumbled back, my mind screaming for me to run, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze as the shadows closed in. And then I realized Mia wasn't just a victim, she was the one holding the door open. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in that circle, staring into those glowing eyes. Time felt like it had unraveled, stretching into something unrecognizable. The figure loomed over me, its shadowy form twisting like smoke caught in a violent wind. Every instinct screamed for me to move, to run, but my legs were rooted to the ground. "Mia!" I managed to choke out. "Stop this! Whatever this is, just stop!" But she didn't flinch. She stood at the edge of the circle, her small face expressionless, watching me like she was observing the final act of a play she'd seen 1,000 times. The flames of the candles flickered higher, casting long, writhing shadows that seemed alive. "It's already started," she said, her voice eerily calm, too calm for a child. "You can't stop it." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. My heart hammered as I racked my brain for something, anything, that could break this nightmare. My eyes darted to the book I'd brought with me, now lying open on the ground near Mia's feet. The pages fluttered wildly, as if caught in an invisible storm, revealing the same phrase over and over. The door must open. I took a shaky step forward, my hand reaching for the book. "Mia," I said, my voice trembling, "you don't have to do this. Whatever this is, it doesn't have to be this way." Her gaze didn't waver. "It's not up to me," she said simply. Then the figure moved. For something made of shadows, it had a terrifying weight to it, each step sending vibrations through the ground. It stopped just inches from me, its glowing eyes burning into mine. A cold, suffocating pressure wrapped around my chest, like invisible hands squeezing the air out of my lungs. I dropped to my knees, gasping, as the figure's form seemed to grow larger, darker, until it blocked out everything else. The clearing, the trees, even Mia, all of it vanished, leaving me alone in a void with this thing. Its voice echoed in my mind, low and guttural, a sound that wasn't made for human ears. "You are the key," it said. "The door will open, and you will bring it forth." Bring what forth? My thoughts spiraled as I clawed at the ground, trying to find something solid to anchor myself to. I wasn't going to let this happen, not without a fight. I focused on the book again, the only thing that seemed remotely tied to what was happening. If it had answers, I needed to find them now. Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I lunged toward the book. My fingers closed around the cover, and the moment I touched it, a jolt of electricity shot through me. Images flooded my mind, rituals, sacrifices, and the same shadowy figure, always watching, always waiting. The book burned in my hands, but I didn't let go. Somewhere in the storm of images, I saw a single line that stood out like a beacon. "The fire breaks the cycle." My eyes snapped open, and I knew what I had to do. The candles. With a scream that tore through my throat, I pushed myself to my feet and staggered toward the nearest flame. The shadow figure roared, a sound that made the ground shake. But I didn't stop. I kicked over the candle, stomping out the flame, and the air around me seemed to ripple like water. One by one, I extinguished the candles, each flame snuffing out with a hiss. The figure lashed out, its shadowy arms clawing at me, but each step I took felt lighter, freer. When I reached the last candle, I hesitated for a split second, glancing back at Mia. She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face as she shook her head. "You can't," she whispered. "It won't stop." I didn't listen. With one final stomp, I crushed the last flame. The clearing exploded with light, blinding and searing. The figure let out an inhuman shriek, its form dissolving into the air like smoke caught in a gale. The pressure around me lifted, and for the first time in days I could breathe again. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The candles were gone. The book was ash in my hands. And Mia was lying on the ground, unconscious but breathing. I dropped to my knees beside her, my body trembling with exhaustion. It's been weeks since that night, and I wish I could say things went back to normal, but they didn't. Mia doesn't remember anything. Not the drawings, not the ritual, not even me. Her father pulled her from my care, saying she seemed better now, happier. Maybe she is. Maybe she's free. But I'm not. The tapping never stopped. Every night, it's there, at my window. The glowing eyes are gone, but the shadows in my apartment seem to move when I'm not looking. And sometimes, late at night, I find myself drawing. I don't know what it means, and I don't want to. All I know is that I can't stop, and I can't escape. When I got the call from the lawyer's office, I honestly thought it was a mistake. "Your grandmother Evelyn left you her estate," the man said, his voice flat, like he said those words every day. "Estate?" I laughed nervously. "She had an apartment, not an estate." "No," he clarified. "A property in Silver Creek, upstate New York, a house." That was the first shock. Evelyn never mentioned owning a house. She was a city woman through and through. Coffee shops, theater, her tiny apartment in Brooklyn crammed with vintage books and knickknacks. I couldn't imagine her in some old house in the countryside, but then again I couldn't claim to know her that well. I mean, we were close when I was a kid, but after my parents died, Evelyn sort of changed. She became distant, quiet, like she was carrying something heavy she didn't want to share. I didn't push. I was a teenager, busy with my own stuff, and later, life just got in the way. Anyway, the next thing I knew, I was driving up a winding road surrounded by trees that seemed like they'd been there since the beginning of time. The house came into view, and wow, it was nothing like I'd expected. It wasn't a mansion or anything, but it had this old-world charm, Victorian style, with peeling white paint and ivy crawling up one side. It looked like it had a story to tell, one I wasn't sure I wanted to hear. Walking inside felt like stepping into another era. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick, like the house had been holding its breath for years. I found myself wandering from room to room, trying to imagine Evelyn here. The kitchen had a retro vibe, with pastel tiles and an ancient-looking oven. The living room was cozy but eerie, full of furniture covered in white sheets. It felt paused, like someone had walked out mid-sentence and never returned. Then I found the room upstairs. It was locked, which was weird because none of the other doors were. The key turned out to be in the drawer of an old desk downstairs, tucked under a stack of unopened letters addressed to Evelyn. I didn't open them. Something about it felt invasive, like reading someone's diary. When I finally got the door open, it felt like stepping into a secret. The room was smaller than the others, almost cramped, with walls lined in dark wood. But what really caught my attention was the mirror. It was huge, taking up nearly the entire wall opposite the bed. The frame was silver, ornate, almost gothic, with these strange symbols etched into it that I couldn't quite place. It was the kind of thing you'd see in a museum, not a dusty old house. For some reason, I couldn't look away. My reflection stared back, of course, but something about it felt off, like there was an invisible barrier between me and the image. The symbols on the frame seemed to shimmer in the fading daylight, almost like they were alive. I reached out to touch them, but the metal was ice cold, and I jerked my hand back. That's when I heard a voice. "Oh, so you found it," someone said behind me. I nearly jumped out of my skin, spinning around to see a woman standing in the doorway. She looked to be in her 70s, with sharp gray eyes and a knowing smile. "I'm Harper," she introduced herself. "I live next door. Well, next door is a stretch out here, but close enough." I nodded, still catching my breath. I didn't know Evelyn had neighbors. "Oh, we weren't exactly close," she said, stepping further into the room. Her gaze flicked to the mirror, and her expression darkened. She didn't bring many people here, for good reason. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, like she was deciding whether or not to say more. "Just that Evelyn was particular about this house, especially that mirror. Always said it wasn't meant for just anyone." I tried to laugh it off. "It's just a mirror." Her eyes snapped to mine, and for a moment they looked sharper than before. "Is it?" That stuck with me long after she left. I couldn't stop staring at the mirror, at my own reflection. I even waved my hand to see if it would follow. It did. But there was a flicker, a tiny, almost imperceptible lag, like the reflection wasn't entirely mine. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just an old house playing tricks on my mind. Still, when I went to bed that night, I locked the door. Not that it helped. Because in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of faint whispers. And when I turned on the light, the mirror was glowing faintly, like it was holding a secret it wasn't ready to share. I woke up the next morning feeling like I'd barely slept. The whispers I heard in the middle of the night. I convinced myself they were just a dream, or maybe the old house settling. But when I looked at the mirror again, that unsettling feeling crept back into my chest. The symbols on the frame seemed darker in the daylight, like they'd been etched deeper into the metal overnight. I reached out and ran my fingers along one of the markings. It felt rough, almost like a scar. I told myself it was just my imagination and stepped away. The rest of the house needed attention anyway. If I was going to stay here, I couldn't let it stay this dusty. So I spent the day cleaning, trying to focus on the normal things, wiping counters, airing out rooms, and figuring out how many boxes of junk I'd need to haul away. But no matter where I went in the house, I felt it, the pull of the mirror upstairs. It was like a weight hanging in the back of my mind, whispering for me to come back. Around noon, Mrs. Harper stopped by with a basket of muffins, the kind neighborly gesture that would have felt sweet if she weren't so odd. She watched me like she was waiting for me to say something, her eyes darting to the staircase every few minutes. "You don't look like you slept well," she said finally, setting the basket down on the kitchen counter. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Old houses make weird noises. Nothing I'm not used to." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's not the house making the noise." That comment froze me. What's that supposed to mean? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out the window, her expression unreadable. "Evelyn and we weren't close," she said slowly, "but I knew enough to stay away from that room. She warned me, and I listened." "Warned you about what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Finally, she turned back to me. "That mirror. It's not just some antique, Clara. There's a reason she kept this place locked up all these years. Whatever you do, don't let it get inside your head." I wanted to laugh it off, tell her she sounded ridiculous. But the way she looked at me, so serious, so sure, it made me pause. After she left, I found myself back upstairs, standing in front of the mirror again. I couldn't help it. It was like a magnet pulling me in. I stared at my reflection, looking for something, anything, that might explain why this thing had everyone so spooked. At first, everything seemed normal. My reflection moved when I did, blinked when I blinked. But then, there it was. The lag. It was so slight I almost missed it, but it was there. I waved my hand slowly, watching as my reflection followed just a fraction of a second too late. "Okay," I whispered to myself, trying to keep calm. "It's an old mirror. It's probably warped or something." But deep down, I didn't believe that. Not after what happened next. I leaned in closer, studying the symbols along the frame. And that's when I saw it. My reflection didn't lean in with me. It just stood there, staring back, its eyes darker than before. My stomach dropped. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat, but the reflection didn't move. It stayed frozen for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, it smiled. I bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I sat on the floor at the top of the stairs, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I'd seen. The rest of the day I avoided the mirror like the plague. I tried to distract myself by going through Evelyn's old things, but every time I opened a drawer or picked up a box, it felt like I was uncovering pieces of a puzzle I didn't know how to solve. That's when I found the journal. It was tucked away in a locked chest in Evelyn's closet, along with old photographs and a few pieces of jewelry. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages were filled with Evelyn's tight, neat handwriting. Most of it seemed like ramblings about her travels and people she'd met. But then I found a section marked with the same symbols as the mirror. It wasn't just a mirror, I learned. Evelyn wrote about a group called the Order of the Reflection, people who believed mirrors were gateways to other worlds. She wrote about rituals, warnings, and something called the true self. "The true self cannot be ignored," one entry read. "It will demand to be seen." I closed the journal, my hands shaking. Suddenly, the whispers from last night didn't feel like a dream anymore, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror wasn't just some creepy artifact. It was watching me. I didn't even scream. I couldn't. The sight of the mirror at the foot of my bed rooted me to the mattress, my breath shallow and quick. It wasn't supposed to be there. I'd locked it upstairs. I knew I had, but there it was, its silver frame gleaming faintly in the moonlight streaming through the window. My reflection stared back at me, unnervingly still. I sat up slowly, my body trembling as I tried to convince myself this wasn't real. Then the reflection moved, not in sync with me, not like it should. It tilted its head to the side, an eerie, unnatural movement, and smiled. That same crooked, malicious smile I'd seen before. Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, its lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. I felt them. They weren't coming from the mirror. They were in my head. "You know who I am. You've always known." I shook my head violently, scrambling out of bed and backing away until I hit the wall. No, this isn't happening. This isn't real." "You can't hide from me, Clara. I am you." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. My legs gave out and I slid down the wall, my heart racing. The reflection began to change. Its face twisted, its features becoming darker, sharper. The eyes turned pitch black, and its mouth stretched into something inhuman. I couldn't take my eyes off it, no matter how much I wanted to. And then, it started moving toward me. Not the mirror itself, the reflection. It pressed against the glass like it was testing the barrier, its hands flat against the surface. I screamed, the sound finally breaking free from my throat. My instinct took over, and I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a heavy book from my nightstand, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. Instead, the reflection laughed, the sound echoing inside my head like nails on a chalkboard. "You can't stop me," it said aloud this time, the voice low and distorted. "I've waited long enough." Panicking, I bolted out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. My feet carried me down the stairs without thinking, but the whispers followed, growing louder with every step. I reached the living room, grabbing my phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen was blank, unresponsive. The power had gone out. I needed to get out of the house. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the whole house had turned against me. Desperate, I turned back toward the stairs, and that's when I saw it. The mirror. It was standing at the bottom of the staircase, blocking my way. But this time, the reflection wasn't alone. Shadows moved within the glass, writhing and twisting like they were alive. I could hear faint voices now, overlapping, whispering things I couldn't understand. "Why are you doing this to me?" I cried, my voice breaking. The reflection tilted its head again, that same unnatural movement, and smiled wider. "You already know the answer." And then it hit me. The memories I'd buried so deep they felt like someone else's life. Evelyn, yelling at me that day in her apartment, her voice full of anger and fear. The way she'd clutched the mirror, refusing to let me take it. And then, my hands, pushing her. The sound of her head hitting the corner of the table. I sank to the floor, tears streaming down my face. No, I didn't mean to. It was an accident. The reflection stepped through the glass. It didn't climb out or break the surface. It simply stepped out, like the mirror was nothing more than a doorway. It stood before me now, taller, darker, more real than I wanted it to be. "You killed her," it said, its voice cold and accusing. "You killed her to save yourself." I shook my head, sobbing. I didn't know. I didn't understand. "But you do now." It leaned in closer, its black eyes locking onto mine. "And now it's my turn." I scrambled back, my hands searching for anything to defend myself. My fingers closed around a fire poker near the fireplace. I swung it wildly, connecting with the reflection's side. It let out a guttural growl, staggering back, but it didn't fall. "You think you can stop me?" it hissed. "I'm you, Clara. You can't escape what you are." I didn't respond. I swung again, aiming for the mirror this time. The glass shattered on impact, the shards raining down in a cascade of silver. For a moment, everything went silent. The reflection let out a scream, a sound so piercing it felt like it would split my skull, and then it disappeared. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The mirror was gone, just shards of glass and a broken frame. But the house felt different now, heavier, like the fight wasn't over. Gancho. I looked at the shattered glass around me, relief washing over me. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a sliver of the mirror still intact, and in it, the reflection was smiling. I stared at the shard of mirror, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection shouldn't have been there. It shouldn't have been smiling. I scrambled backward, away from the sliver of glass, my hands shaking uncontrollably. "You can't be here," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I destroyed you." The smile on the reflection widened, and it spoke, the words echoing in my head as much as in the room. "Did you really think it would be that easy?" My stomach twisted into knots. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fight this thing anymore. The fire poker still sat in my hand, but what good was it now? I'd shattered the mirror, and yet here it was, taunting me from a fragment. I wanted to run, to leave the house and never look back, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor, and the whispers were back, circling around me like a storm. They weren't just coming from the shard anymore. They were everywhere. "You killed her," the voices hissed. "You wanted the mirror. You thought it would protect you." "No," I shouted, covering my ears. "It wasn't like that. I didn't know." But even as I said the words, I felt the weight of the truth. I had pushed Evelyn. I had grabbed the mirror from her hands. I told myself it was an accident, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had let my desperation take over. The shard of mirror began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, until the entire room was bathed in its eerie light. The air felt thick, heavy, like it was pulling me toward it. "No," I said again, shaking my head. "I won't let you take me." The reflection tilted its head, its black eyes boring into mine. "You don't have a choice." And then it happened. The shard lifted off the ground, floating in the air, spinning slowly. The light grew blinding, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, like gravity had shifted. I dug my heels into the floor, gripping the fire poker with both hands, but it was no use. The force was too strong. I screamed as the shard drew closer, its edges spinning faster and faster. The air around me crackled, and then everything went white. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the living room anymore. I was standing in a space that seemed endless, the ground beneath my feet cold and reflective, like a giant mirror. Shadows moved all around me, faceless forms that whispered and murmured in languages I couldn't understand. "No," I said, spinning around, looking for a way out. "This isn't real." But it was. I knew it was. The reflection appeared before me, fully formed, its face a perfect copy of mine, except for the black eyes and that twisted smile. "This is where you belong," it said, its voice calm, almost soothing. "You took the mirror. You wanted its power. Now you can have it."
"I don't want it," I shouted. "Take it back. Take everything back."
The reflection laughed, a low mocking sound. "It doesn't work that way, Clara. You can't undo what's been done." I lunged at it, swinging the fire poker with all the strength I had left, but it passed right through the figure as if it were smoke. The reflection didn't flinch. It just stood there, smiling. "You can't fight me," it said. "You are me." "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I'm not like you." "Aren't you?" It stepped closer, its voice soft, almost kind. "You killed for this. You wanted it so badly you were willing to take a life. Now it's yours. Forever." I dropped the fire poker, my knees buckling as I fell to the ground. "Please," I begged. "I didn't mean to. I'll do anything. Just let me go." But the reflection didn't respond. It simply turned and walked away, fading into the endless expanse of the mirrored world. I screamed after it, my voice echoing into nothingness. And then I saw it. My reflection, in the shard of glass I had shattered. Only it wasn't me anymore. It was the other me, the one with black eyes and that awful smile. It was standing in the living room, in my body, looking out at the world with a triumphant expression. "No!" I shouted, pounding on the mirrored ground beneath me. "That's my life. You can't take it." But it was already gone. The reflection, my reflection, was free, and I was trapped. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't seem to exist in this place. I can only watch through shards and fragments as it lives my life. It's better at being me than I ever was. Charming, confident, perfect. But every now and then, it looks into a mirror, and for just a moment, it locks eyes with me, and it smiles.